much, Perrine, for the introduction and for inviting me today, and thanks to UPM for hosting this wonderful event. So I want to talk to you today a bit about transparency on emissions from the industry perspective. So we're not talking about how you measure emissions, maybe with a device or a radar, but how companies measure their own emissions and report them. So you will see that those are kind of two very different things. So I've been in this world for about 9 years now, looking at carbon accounting. And when I first started, we were in the beginning of this measuring CO2. So we did the carbon footprint of a Chiquita banana and Asics sneakers and things like that. And then, it got more and more complicated over time. So we moved to IT equipment, LED light bulbs versus compact fluorescents, motors, and then I moved into freight transportation. So we talked a lot about freight yesterday and the issues there. So I'll focus a bit on that, and then I'll move to our work in the mining sector. So when I first got into the topic of freight transportation, what we saw is we see a pattern with carbon accounting that, the focus goes on a particular industry, and then people try to rise to the occasion and try to figure out the carbon footprint of the industry. So what we saw in the freight transportation sector were a proliferation of different methods coming around. So you can see a whole pile of them there. Different modes of transports had different methods, different governments had different methods, and what we saw was that you couldn't compare the results. So there wasn't one single way to calculate the carbon emissions from freight. So that makes it very difficult for an end user, so maybe a customer that's ordering something from Amazon, or a shipper like a HP that ships many things around the globe. How do you actually total up those emissions and know what your impact is? So we wrote the GLEC framework, the Global Logistics Emissions Council framework, and we did that in a very, I would say, diplomatic way. So we assembled many partners from around the world, many different stakeholders along the freight supply chain, from the actual operators like Maersk or DHL to logistics service providers, and then the end users. And we got together and wrote a method together that works for everybody. So that's the GLEC framework. You can see some of our partners there. And the basis of the framework is to, like I said, have everybody calculate the same way. So we address all different modes of transportation: planes, trains, ships, trucks, warehouses, ports, terminals, and then the 3 scopes of emissions. So scope 1, your own operational emissions. Scope 2 is electricity. Scope 3 is your supply chain. So everybody can calculate, no matter where they are in the supply chain. And then which GHGs are considered. So are you considering methane along with CO2? So these things become really important and can really affect the numbers. And on the lower right-hand side, you can see the fuel life cycle. So I want to talk a little bit about what that means, because it's particularly important to the decarbonization challenge. So in the fuel life cycle, you have the production and distribution of fuel, then you have the combustion of fuel. Okay, so usually when we think about emissions, we think about combustion. But there's actually quite a large impact from the production of fuel. So let me show you what that means, or what that looks like. These are different types of fuel. And the orange is that production and distribution of the fuel. So that's where it's mined, extracted, transported to the pump, and then the yellow is the combustion. And so what you can see here is that biodiesel, bioethanol, these alternative fuels, the impact is all in the upstream, so this production and distribution. And what we see happening with companies is that they don't always want to include that in their accounting. And so that if you don't include it, it may look like you don't have any emissions, which is not what we want to see. So I don't have hydrogen on this list. There isn't a good number for hydrogen. But you can see it's very, very important to standardize these emissions. Another activity we did with this, the GLEC framework, is to come up with industry average numbers for different types of transportation. So if you don't know what truck or ship your goods are going on, which is often the case, we give you the best numbers, the best estimates as to what the emissions are. So this is CO2e per ton kilometer. So this is a metric for freight transportation. And what you can see here is a huge range of numbers. So if you look at the framework, you'll see the individual numbers, but I'm showing you the ranges here. So you can see, say, for example, the road sector, how big of a difference there can be depending what type of vehicle or vessel you're on. So it's quite important to have an understanding of that, or you might be underestimating. Okay, so let's look at reporting today. So CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, this is where companies report their carbon emissions. So let's take a look at how that looks today. This figure shows on the top, we have emissions reported to CDP. Okay, so that's the small bar. And on the bottom, we have the transportation emissions from the International Transport Forum, their 2019 outlook. And what I'm showing you here is quite an underestimation. So we're missing quite a bit of reported emissions if you look at CDP. But what I think is interesting here is air emissions are larger than the ITF estimates. And why is that? I don't know. But we could guess that perhaps it has to do with flight shame and companies really wanting to report their emissions. And so we see, yes, they're actually higher than we estimated. So let's look at transportation again, and now I'm going to hurry up because my time is running down, but these are transportation emissions, supply chain transportation emissions reported by different sectors. And on the top you see metal smelting, refining, and forming. So this is how steel or copper is made. It's generally really high emissions intensity process. So you can see a huge number there for metal smelting. So what is the story there? That made me quite curious. Why is that so high? These are the companies that make up that number, and you can see it's really just one company makes up the majority of those emissions in the gray bar. JSW Steel, that actually was not one I had ever heard of before. It's an Indian smelting company. And the reason I'm showing you this is just to show that that is not the biggest company in the world. That's a relatively small company, but they just happen to be having a moment of radical honesty about their transportation emissions. So how does that look compared to the mining industry? So companies like Valley and BHP, they send their iron ore to companies like JSW Steel for smelting. So you can see that their emissions are reported much, much higher than some of the biggest iron ore mining companies in the world. So it doesn't really make sense. Okay, so back to carbon accounting. So I mentioned how with freight transportation we saw a proliferation of different methods coming about. The focus was on freight and many methods came about. We see the same thing happening with mining. Okay, we're starting to really think about what are the emissions from mining, what does it mean for renewable energy, for the construction sector, all these sectors that use mined materials. So we see the same thing happening. All these new methods coming up, all these new certification and procurement programs, and the same problem is coming, right? What is the method? How are we actually calculating the emissions, and how can we make sure we're getting to a good number? And as mining companies themselves are looking to decarbonize, right, they're switching to alternative fuels. They're doing all the same things that we've been talking about over the last day and that the COP is really focused on. How can we actually tell if we are buying the good steel or the good copper for our products? It's very, very hard to know. Okay, so when you think about circular economy, what is the difference between, carbon footprint-wise, what is the difference between a recycled copper and copper from a green mine? It's very hard to know what the actual emissions are. So why does that matter? We want the emissions to be part of procurement schemes, green commodity markets, ESGs, policies. We have climate-smart mining requirements. How will we do that without a good CO2 number? And how will we track our progress to our climate goals? So that's what Perrine and I have been working on, is this coalition on minerals emissions transparency. So how do we actually do this? How do we report and share these numbers and work together to understand and reduce carbon emissions from the sector? I'm going to leave it there, but please feel free to contact me or Perrine to learn more about the initiative. And if you want to learn more about carbon accounting, I'm here for you. Thanks a lot.